The most dangerous woman I ever met never raised her voice. She never insulted me. She never appeared cruel. In the beginning, she felt like safety itself. She listened. She understood. She mirrored my values so precisely that I mistook familiarity for fate. Everyone around us approved. I thought I had chosen well. I was wrong. 6 months later, I was sitting alone in my car, parked outside my own apartment, delaying the moment I would walk inside. Not because I was afraid of her temper, but because I no longer trusted my own mind. My memory felt unreliable. My judgment felt compromised. I was constantly apologizing for things I couldn't clearly remember doing. I felt guilty without knowing why. That is how real psychological danger works. It doesn't attack you directly. It slowly teaches you to attack yourself. The most destructive people don't look like predators. They look like wounded souls who need understanding. And by the time you realize what's happening, your sense of self is already entangled in their chaos. In this video, I'm going to expose the subtle psychological patterns that quietly dismantle men from the inside out. Patterns most people never see until it's too late. Before we continue, leave a comment with where you're watching from and your local time. And if this kind of clarity matters to you, consider subscribing. At the beginning, there was nothing to resist. She didn't arrive as a problem. She arrived as a solution. Calm, curious, emotionally fluent. She asked questions most people never ask and listened in a way that made silence feel safe. When I spoke, she didn't interrupt. She reflected my thoughts back to me with such precision that I assumed depth meant compatibility. Friends admired her immediately. Family felt relieved. She fit seamlessly into every social space I brought her into. There were no obvious warning signs, no volatility, no chaos. If anything, she seemed unusually self-aware, thoughtful, gentle. I told myself I was lucky. The intimacy accelerated, but it didn't feel rushed. That was the deception. It felt earned. Long conversations, confessions framed as trust, stories about her past delivered with controlled vulnerability. She spoke about wounds without hysteria pain, without rage. It made me believe she had already done the work. I didn't notice when the center of gravity shifted. She began sharing more, not casually, heavily. Childhood memories, failed relationships, deep fears, emotional patterns she said she was trying to understand. I listened. I stayed present. I offered perspective when asked, support when needed. It felt like connection. It felt like intimacy. What I didn't recognize was the imbalance forming beneath the surface. The conversation stopped being mutual. My inner life became secondary. When I spoke about my day, my thoughts, my stress, it circled back to her emotions, her reactions, her interpretations, her triggers. Without any explicit agreement, I became the emotional regulator in the room. She never demanded it. She didn't have to. Her distress was quiet but persistent, a tension that hovered just below the surface. If I didn't respond the right way, it surfaced. If I misread her tone, it surfaced. If I needed space, it surfaced. Not explosively, subtly, through withdrawal, disappointment, a shift in atmosphere that made me feel responsible for restoring equilibrium. That's how it starts. Not with control, but with accommodation. I adjusted without realizing it. I chose words more carefully. I softened opinions. I anticipated reactions. I began managing her emotional state the way you manage something fragile, not consciously, automatically. She framed this dynamic as closeness. She said she had never felt so understood, so safe, so connected. I believed her, and part of me felt proud, needed, chosen, but something else was happening beneath my awareness. Her anxiety didn't stay hers. It migrated. Her uncertainty became mine. Her emotional volatility reorganized my internal landscape. I found myself replaying conversations long after they ended, searching for mistakes I might have made. I apologized more often, not because I was wrong, but because tension made me uncomfortable. The first real fracture appeared quietly. One evening, she accused me of something minor: a tone, a look, a moment of absence. I didn't remember it the way she described it. I explained calmly. She listened, then told me I was mistaken, not angrily, gently, as if correcting a child. I let it go. That was the mistake. From that moment forward, reality became negotiable. Small disagreements about memory, interpretation, intent, each one insignificant on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. When I trusted my recollection, conflict followed. When I deferred to hers, peace returned. So I deferred. I didn't think of it as surrender. I thought of it as empathy. The more I adapted, the more she disclosed. The disclosures became heavier, more frequent, less processed. She wasn't sharing to connect anymore. She was unloading, downloading her emotional weight into me and walking away lighter. I carried it without question. Her moods dictated the structure of my days. Her reactions shaped my decisions. If she was unsettled, nothing else mattered. If she was calm, I felt relief rather than joy. My nervous system began calibrating itself around hers. Gradually, her inner chaos became my external reality. I stopped noticing when my body stayed tense, even in quiet moments. I stopped questioning why I felt exhausted after conversations that appeared loving. I told myself this was what emotional depth felt like, that relationships required effort, that support meant sacrifice. What I didn't understand was not all effort is mutual and not all sacrifice is healthy. She never took responsibility for the emotional burden she transferred. She spoke as if sharing was healing, as if vulnerability absolved her of ownership. And I accepted that logic because it made me feel useful. That was the trap. I believed I was helping her heal while she was avoiding the work entirely. I was stabilizing her so she wouldn't have to stabilize herself. I was absorbing discomfort so she wouldn't have to face it. And the more I did that, the less room there was for me. I began losing touch with myself in ways that were hard to name. My preferences blurred, my instincts softened. I hesitated where I once acted. I felt guilty without a clear cause. I felt responsible for emotions that didn't originate in me. There was no single moment where everything collapsed, no dramatic incident, just a slow erosion. The relationship still looked good from the outside. She was still kind, still articulate, still emotionally expressive. But inside I was fragmenting, quietly, invisibly. I didn't realize I'd already crossed the threshold, that the dynamic was no longer two people relating, but one person regulating another at the cost of his own stability. By the time I sensed something was wrong, the confusion had already taken root. And the deeper patterns, the ones that would dismantle my sense of self entirely, were just beginning to activate. I didn't notice the moment I became complicit. There was no agreement, no conversation where roles were defined. It happened the way most psychological shifts happen, through repetition, through small choices that felt reasonable in isolation, through silence where clarity should have been. I told myself I was being supportive, that this was what strength looked like, that relationships required one person to hold steady when the other was struggling. I believed that if I stayed calm enough, present enough, patient enough, things would eventually balance out. They didn't. The more I carried, the more there was to carry. She began relying on me not just for comfort, but for regulation. If she felt anxious, I was expected to ground her. If she felt overwhelmed, I was expected to organize the chaos. If she felt empty, I was expected to fill the space. My presence wasn't companionship anymore. It was medication. And like any substance that provides relief, she needed more of it over time. I stopped asking myself whether this dynamic was sustainable. I focused on whether she was okay. I postponed my own needs because they felt less urgent, less justified. I told myself I could deal with them later. Later never came. I started noticing that when I struggled, there was no space for it. My discomfort created tension. My fatigue disrupted the emotional equilibrium she depended on. When I needed support, she became distant, overwhelmed, or subtly resentful. Not overtly. Never overtly. Just enough to remind me that my vulnerability came at a cost, so I learned to contain it. That's when the addiction formed. Not to her exactly, to the feeling of being needed, to the identity of the steady one, the one who could handle it, the one who didn't break. I derived meaning from being the anchor because without that role, I didn't know where I stood. She depended on being rescued. I depended on being the rescuer. That mutual dependency felt like intimacy. It wasn't. It was a closed loop that prevented growth on both sides. She avoided responsibility by externalizing her emotional state. I avoided self-examination by focusing on hers. As long as I was managing her instability, I didn't have to confront the slow hollowing out of my own life. The cost showed up physically before it showed up consciously. I slept poorly. My body stayed tense. I felt drained after conversations that appeared gentle on the surface. My nervous system was constantly alert, scanning for shifts in her mood, preparing for corrections I didn't know I needed to make. I became hyper-attuned to her internal state while growing numb to my own. She framed this as closeness. She said we were deeply connected, that we understood each other on a level most people never reach. And in a distorted way, she was right. I understood her intimately. I just didn't understand myself anymore. Every time I absorbed her emotional weight, she felt lighter, more centered, more functional. And every time she stabilized, I felt relief instead of fulfillment, peace instead of joy. The absence of tension became my reward. That's when I should have known something was wrong. Healthy relationships don't make relief feel like love. But I didn't question it. I normalized it. I told myself that depth was heavy, that real connection required endurance, that my exhaustion was proof of commitment. What I didn't see was that she was outsourcing her emotional labor to me. Her anxiety became something I managed. Her triggers became something I navigated. Her unresolved trauma became something I accommodated. She didn't process it. She displaced it. And I made room. She spoke often about healing, about growth, about awareness. But there was no movement, no integration, just repetition. The same wounds revisited, the same stories retold, the same emotional loops reenacted. Nothing resolved because resolution would have ended the dynamic she depended on. I mistook insight for change. That confusion kept me trapped longer than anything else. The more I supported her, the more invested I became in the belief that it was helping. Admitting it wasn't would have meant confronting the reality that my effort was enabling stagnation, that my sacrifice was not noble, but unnecessary. And that realization was threatening. So I stayed. I adjusted further. I shrank parts of myself that created friction. I softened truths that made her uncomfortable. I delayed decisions that might destabilize her. My life began orbiting her emotional state, not because she demanded it, but because it felt safer than disruption. That's how people lose themselves without noticing. Not through force, through adaptation. I wasn't coerced, I was conditioned. Each time I chose harmony over honesty, the pattern reinforced itself. Each time I prioritized her comfort over my clarity, my internal compass weakened. Eventually, I couldn't tell whether something felt wrong because it was wrong, or because I was failing to be supportive enough. That uncertainty became the baseline. I started apologizing automatically, even when I didn't know what I had done, even when nothing specific had happened. Apologies smoothed the emotional surface. They restored calm, and calm had become my primary objective. I didn't see that I was training myself to accept responsibility for things that were never mine. Her emotions were treated as facts. Mine were treated as disruptions. When I felt frustrated, it became evidence of my insensitivity. When I felt tired, it became evidence of withdrawal. When I expressed concern, it became evidence of control. Every internal signal that something was wrong was reframed as a personal flaw. I absorbed that framing slowly, quietly, without resistance. By the time I realized how much I had taken on, my sense of agency was already compromised. I didn't know where my responsibilities ended and hers began. I just knew that if I stopped managing her emotional state, something bad would happen. I didn't know what, just that it would be my fault. That belief kept me compliant. I told myself this was temporary, that once she felt secure enough, things would shift, that once she healed, we would become equals again. But the truth was simpler and harder to accept. She didn't want equality. She wanted relief. And I had become the mechanism that provided it. By the end of that phase, I was no longer a partner. I was a container. A place where unprocessed emotion could be stored so she wouldn't have to feel it. And the longer I played that role, the harder it became to imagine myself outside of it. Because if I wasn't holding her together, who was I? That question scared me enough to stay silent, to keep carrying what wasn't mine, to keep calling it love. I didn't know yet that the next stage would be worse. That projection would replace dependency. That accusation would replace vulnerability. And that the confusion I felt was not accidental but structural. But the foundation had already been laid. The shift into projection didn't announce itself. It didn't feel like an attack. It felt like misunderstanding. She began describing me in ways that didn't align with my actions. At first, it was subtle. She said I was distant when I felt present. She said I was dismissive when I was careful. She said I was selfish when I was exhausted. I assumed I was missing something. I assumed there was a blind spot I needed to correct. So I listened more closely. I explained myself more carefully. I clarified intentions. I slowed my responses. I tried to meet her where she was. The accusations didn't stop. They evolved. What I didn't understand then was that I was no longer interacting with who she actually was. I was interacting with a psychological mirror she had placed over me. A distorted image shaped by qualities she couldn't tolerate in herself. When she accused me of being controlling, it came after I asked for consistency. When she accused me of emotional withdrawal, it came after I asked for space. When she accused me of selfishness, it came after I set a boundary. None of it made sense in isolation. Together, it formed a pattern. She wasn't responding to my behavior. She was reacting to an internal narrative she needed to maintain. This is how projection works. Unacknowledged traits don't disappear. they relocate. They get assigned to someone else and then attacked externally. It allows the person projecting to feel morally intact while discharging internal conflict onto a target. I became that target. Every conversation stopped being about what happened and became about who I was. Facts were irrelevant. Context didn't matter. What mattered was the identity she had assigned to me and her emotional reaction to that identity. I tried to defend myself. Calmly, logically, that was a mistake. Defense was interpreted as evidence. Clarification was interpreted as manipulation. Frustration was interpreted as anger. Silence was interpreted as guilt. There was no correct response because the interaction was no longer relational. It was theatrical. I was playing a role in a script I hadn't written. The more I tried to explain myself, the more trapped I became. Because explanation required engagement, and engagement validated the frame. I didn't realize I was inside a psychological matrix where reality itself had been compromised. She spoke with certainty, with conviction, with emotional intensity that made my own perceptions feel weak by comparison. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply stated who I was as if it were obvious. And over time, that certainty wore me down. I began questioning my own character, not in a dramatic way, quietly, internally. I wondered if maybe I was colder than I thought, more selfish, less available. I replayed interactions looking for confirmation of her claims. I found none, but I kept looking. That's the danger of projection. It doesn't need evidence. It needs repetition. Every accusation planted a seed, and even when I rejected it consciously, part of me absorbed it subconsciously. My self-image became unstable. I started measuring myself against her perceptions instead of my own values. That shift was catastrophic. Once you outsource your identity, you lose your footing. You stop acting from principle and start acting from fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being labeled. Fear of becoming the person someone insists you are. I noticed I was modifying my behavior not because it felt right, but because it might prevent accusation. I spoke less. I revealed less. I chose neutrality over authenticity. That self-suppression didn't bring peace. It brought emptiness. The matrix reinforced itself perfectly. When I withdrew to protect myself, it proved her narrative of emotional unavailability. When I pushed back, it proved her narrative of control. When I disengaged, it proved her narrative of avoidance. There was no way to win, because the game was rigged. The most destructive part was how reasonable it all appeared. She didn't sound irrational. She sounded wounded, hurt, disappointed. That made me feel cruel for questioning her perspective. So I didn't. I accepted responsibility for confusion I didn't create. I apologized for traits I didn't possess. I tried to repair damage that existed only in her internal world. And every time I did, the matrix tightened. Authentic communication became impossible. We weren't discussing events. We were negotiating identities. I wasn't allowed to define myself. I was allowed only to defend against definitions imposed on me. That constant defense drained me faster than conflict ever could. I started feeling like I was always on trial, always being evaluated, always one wrong tone away from indictment. My nervous system stayed activated even during calm moments because calm was temporary. Accusation was inevitable. I didn't realize how much of myself I had lost until I tried to assert something simple. One evening, I told her calmly that I didn't agree with her interpretation of an event. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't invalidate her feelings. I just stated my perspective. She looked at me with quiet certainty and told me my defensiveness was exactly the problem. In that moment, something inside me fractured. There was no space left for me to exist as a separate psychological entity. My reality had no standing, only hers mattered, and any deviation from it was framed as pathology. That's when I understood that the relationship was no longer about connection. It was about control through narrative. She didn't need to dominate my actions. She needed to dominate my self-concept, and she was succeeding. I felt smaller, less solid, less sure. I hesitated before speaking. I doubted before deciding. I second-guessed instincts that had guided me well for years. The most insidious part was how invisible it all was. There were no bruises, no witnesses, no obvious abuse. Just a slow, methodical erosion of certainty. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. From the inside, I was dissolving. By the time I recognized the pattern, I was already deep inside it. And the next transformation, the shift from vulnerability to accusation, from woundedness to prosecution, was already underway. For a long time, I believed her vulnerability was real. She spoke about her past with precision: trauma, abandonment, betrayal. The stories were coherent, the emotions measured. Nothing felt exaggerated. She never used her pain to demand sympathy outright. She simply presented it, and I responded the way I thought a decent man should. I protected, I defended, I adjusted. That was the role she needed me in. The victim presentation was subtle but constant. She framed herself as someone who had been misunderstood, mistreated, and emotionally neglected by people who lacked depth. She didn't call herself a victim. She didn't need to. The implication was enough. Every boundary I tried to set was filtered through that lens. If I asked for space, it triggered abandonment. If I asked for accountability, it triggered persecution. If I asked for balance, it triggered pain. She didn't argue against the boundary itself. She argued from injury. An injury is difficult to challenge without feeling cruel. That's how the inversion begins. The person you're trying to protect starts prosecuting you. The one you're supporting starts building a case. The wounded becomes the authority. At first, the accusations were framed as confusion, then disappointment, then moral failure. She questioned my intentions, my integrity, my capacity for empathy. Each challenge carried the implication that I was repeating the harm others had inflicted on her. I began to fear becoming another chapter in her trauma narrative. That fear controlled me more effectively than anger ever could. She used language carefully. She didn't accuse directly. She suggested. She implied. She expressed concern about my patterns, my emotional availability, my capacity for care. She spoke as if she were diagnosing rather than blaming. It felt sophisticated. It felt psychological. And that made it harder to resist. Because disagreeing didn't just mean disagreement. It meant invalidating her pain. And invalidating pain, I had learned, made me dangerous. So I absorbed the role she assigned me. I tried to be gentler, more patient, more self-questioning. I adjusted my tone, my timing, my expectations. The more I adjusted, the more ground she gained. The turning point came quietly. One night after a long conversation about her feelings, I mentioned that I was tired, that I needed rest. She went silent, not angry, just withdrawn. When she spoke again, she told me she felt unsafe opening up to someone who couldn't handle emotional depth. That sentence changed everything. Suddenly, my limits were framed as defects. My humanity became evidence against me. I wasn't failing a moment. I was failing a moral test. From that point on, the dynamic flipped. She was no longer the fragile one. She was the judge. I was no longer the protector. I was the suspect. Every disagreement was reinterpreted as harm. Every attempt at self-definition was reframed as defensiveness. I found myself explaining my character more than my actions. And explanation only made things worse. Because she wasn't listening to understand. She was listening to confirm. The most disorienting part was how skilled she was at it. She never raised her voice, never threatened, never overtly controlled. She simply positioned herself as the wounded party responding to my deficiencies. And that made me feel dangerous. I began censoring myself, not to keep the peace, but to avoid being perceived as harmful. I worried about the emotional impact of words before their truth. I weighed every sentence against the possibility of being labeled insensitive or cold. That internal policing hollowed me out. The victim narrative gave her absolute leverage. Any challenge to her behavior became further evidence of victimization. Any attempt at boundary setting became abandonment. Any request for accountability became emotional violence. There was no path forward that didn't indict me. I didn't realize how inverted the dynamic had become until someone close to me asked why I seemed afraid in my own relationship. I didn't have an answer. I just knew that speaking freely felt dangerous. That's when I understood the predator-victim reversal. The presentation of fragility had been a tactical position, not necessarily conscious, not necessarily malicious, but effective. It allowed her to control without appearing to control, to dominate while seeming wounded. And I participated in it. I mistook her pain for innocence. I believed that suffering excused behavior. I assumed that because she had been hurt, she couldn't be harmful. That assumption kept me trapped longer than anything else. Because the truth is simple and uncomfortable. Pain does not prevent people from causing damage. Trauma does not make someone safe. Vulnerability does not equal accountability. By the time I recognized that her victimhood had become a weapon, I was already entangled in it. My sense of self had been compromised. My boundaries had been reframed as cruelty. My exhaustion had been reframed as emotional failure. And the person I had tried to save was no longer asking to be saved. She was demanding compliance. The next phase wasn't louder, it was colder. Dependency turned into extraction. Vulnerability turned into entitlement. And the relationship turned from a connection into a system designed to feed off my psychological energy. I didn't know it yet, but I was no longer a partner. I was a resource. Once I understood that something had shifted, it was already too late to step back without consequence. She no longer related to me as someone beside her. She related to me as something she drew from. Emotional energy, attention, stability, regulation. I provided all of it, and the more consistently I provided it, the less she offered in return. That was the nature of the parasitic dynamic. She didn't want partnership. Partnership implies reciprocity, balance, mutual responsibility. What she wanted was a host. Someone who could sustain her internal instability indefinitely while asking for nothing that might disrupt the flow. She presented herself as someone with immense potential. She spoke about who she could become once she healed, once circumstances changed, once she felt safe enough. That promise kept me invested. I believed that if I stayed steady long enough, I would eventually meet the version of her I was sacrificing for. That version never arrived. Every time I helped her avoid consequences, the pattern strengthened. Every time I solved a problem she should have faced herself, the dependency deepened. My effort didn't move her forward. It anchored her in place. I didn't see it because the dynamic rewarded me emotionally in small ways. When I rescued her, she expressed gratitude. When I stabilized her, she expressed closeness. Those moments felt meaningful, but they were temporary relief, not progress. The hunger never ended. No amount of reassurance satisfied her. No amount of presence calmed her for long. The need regenerated constantly because it wasn't about specific fears. It was about control over my attention and energy. She fed on being needed, and I fed on the belief that my presence mattered. That mutual reinforcement created a closed system. I gave more. She required more. The relationship became an economy where my psychological resources were the primary currency. I began to feel depleted in ways that sleep didn't fix. Conversations left me empty. Silence felt heavy. I couldn't remember the last time I felt restored by being with her. I told myself this was temporary, that healing takes time, that love requires endurance. But endurance without nourishment is just slow erosion. The parasitic dynamic also distorted time. The future was always deferred. Things would improve later, after this phase, after this struggle, after this breakthrough that never came. I was investing in a future that required her to become someone she had no incentive to become. Because healing would have ended the arrangement. If she became emotionally regulated, she wouldn't need me the way she did. If she developed stability, my role would shrink. And she wasn't willing to risk that loss. So the wounds stayed open. She spoke about them constantly, revisited them, reinterpreted them, but never integrated them. Processing would have reduced her dependence. Repetition maintained it. I started noticing how my success triggered subtle reactions. If something good happened to me, she became distant. If I felt confident, she grew uneasy. If I talked about growth, she framed it as abandonment. My vitality threatened the system. Vitality. The more I stabilized, the less useful I became. That's when I realized she wasn't attached to me as a person. She was attached to the function I served. Emotional parasitism doesn't look like cruelty. It looks like need, like fragility, like dependence. That's why it's so effective. Refusing to participate feels heartless. Setting limits feels like betrayal. I felt guilty for wanting rest, guilty for wanting space, guilty for wanting more than emotional labor. She reinforced that guilt subtly. She spoke about how safe she felt with me, how much she relied on me, how losing me would devastate her. None of it was explicitly manipulative. All of it was binding. The implication was clear. If I stopped providing, she would collapse, and I would be responsible. That belief trapped me more securely than any threat could. I stopped sharing my own struggles entirely. There was no room for them. My pain created inconvenience. Her pain created obligation. The hierarchy was unspoken, but absolute. I existed to feed the dynamic. The irony was brutal. The more I gave, the less human I felt. The more I supported, the less supported I was. The more I loved, the more empty I became. And still I stayed, because leaving meant confronting a terrifying possibility. That my devotion had been misplaced. That my effort had not been healing. That my sacrifice had not been noble. It was easier to believe that if I just gave a little more, things would finally balance. They didn't. The parasitic dynamic intensified over time. Her needs expanded. Her tolerance for frustration shrank. She expected immediate responsiveness, immediate reassurance, immediate availability. Any delay was interpreted as neglect. My life narrowed around her emotional state. Friends faded. Interests dissolved. My world contracted to the size of her needs. I didn't notice it happening because it happened incrementally. Each small compromise felt insignificant. Together, they reshaped my entire life. I was exhausted, but I couldn't rest. Any withdrawal triggered distress. Any distance triggered accusation. I learned that my presence was not optional. That realization should have terrified me. Instead, it normalized. I adapted. And in adapting, I lost the last traces of balance I had left. The parasitic relationship had no natural endpoint. It could only end through collapse, either hers or mine. And as the system demanded more and more from me, it became clear which collapse was approaching. The next phase didn't involve need at all. It involved image, control, and a mask that made everything more confusing than ever. From the outside, everything looked intact. She was admired, respected, considered thoughtful and emotionally intelligent. People described her as kind, sensitive, mature. They told me I was lucky. They told me I had found someone rare. I nodded. I smiled. I said nothing, because what they saw was not who I lived with. In private, she was controlling in ways that never left fingerprints. She corrected me constantly, not aggressively, casually, as if she were helping. She reframed my words, reinterpreted my intentions, questioned my decisions with a softness that made resistance feel unreasonable. The contrast between her public image and her private behavior created a specific kind of psychological confusion. When someone everyone else sees as good treats you poorly, you don't immediately conclude they are dangerous. You conclude that you are the problem. That was the power of the mask. She used her reputation as insulation. If I felt mistreated, I questioned myself. If I felt controlled, I dismissed it. After all, everyone else experienced her as generous and warm. Who was I to contradict that consensus? I didn't realize that the image itself was part of the control system. When I tried to describe our private dynamic, my words sounded exaggerated even to my own ears. The behavior was subtle, the manipulation indirect. There were no obvious incidents to point to, just a pattern of constant pressure that never appeared in public. That isolation was intentional. She needed the outside world to validate her narrative, so mine would collapse under scrutiny. The more admired she was, the less credible I felt. And she knew it. She expected me to maintain the illusion, to present us as stable, to never contradict her image. Any visible discomfort from me threatened the mask, and that threat was not tolerated. When I looked tired in public, she questioned me later. When I seemed distant, she reminded me of how it reflected on her. My role was not just partner, it was supporting actor in her self-presentation. That was only one layer. The other was chaos. She couldn't tolerate calm for long. When things were peaceful, something had to happen. A misunderstanding, a conflict, a crisis. Not always dramatic, often small, but constant. Minor issues were amplified. Neutral moments were reinterpreted. Silence became danger. Stability felt suspicious. Chaos kept me busy. As long as I was responding to immediate emotional fires, I couldn't step back and see the structure. I was always in reaction mode, always addressing the next issue, always restoring balance. That urgency replaced reflection. She framed the intensity as passion, as depth, as proof of how much we mattered to each other. I believed her. I mistook constant activation for closeness. But chaos was her regulation strategy. Internal instability required external expression. When her inner world felt disordered, she needed the environment to match. Drama externalized what she couldn't process internally. I lived in a state of manufactured emergency. There was always something to fix, something to discuss, something that couldn't wait. My nervous system never downregulated. I stayed alert, attentive, ready. The cost accumulated quietly. I felt tired even on good days. I couldn't relax without anticipating interruption. Peace felt temporary, not grounding. I was living in her emotional weather system, not my own. The mask and the chaos worked together. Publicly, she was controlled and composed. Privately, she was volatile and demanding. The discrepancy made it impossible to get support. No one else saw what I was managing. Friends praised her. Family admired her. Any complaint from me sounded ungrateful. So I stopped complaining. I began doubting my perceptions again. Maybe I was sensitive. Maybe this was normal. Maybe relationships were just harder than people admitted. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Healthy relationships don't require constant crisis management. They don't demand continuous vigilance. They don't punish rest. Yet I couldn't name the problem clearly enough to confront it. The behaviors were too subtle, too defensible, too easy to rationalize, and she was always ready with an explanation. If I felt overwhelmed, she explained why it was understandable given her history. If I felt controlled, she explained why her needs required structure. If I felt exhausted, she explained why love demanded effort. Every explanation sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a cage. The mask ensured no one questioned her. The chaos ensured I never had the clarity to question her either. I didn't realize how much of my life had been reorganized around her until I tried to step outside the pattern. One evening, I declined an argument. I told her calmly that I didn't want to discuss the issue that night, that I needed rest. She reacted not with anger, but with alarm. She told me my withdrawal scared her, that my boundaries made her feel unsafe, that my refusal to engage was a form of abandonment. In that moment, I understood something crucial. Calm threatened her more than conflict ever did, because calm would have forced her to face herself. The chaos wasn't accidental. It was protective. It kept her from confronting the emptiness underneath, and it kept me too busy to leave. By the time I recognized how deeply this system had shaped my reality, the damage was already embedded. My sense of normal had shifted. My tolerance for instability had increased. My expectations for peace had lowered. I was surviving, not living. And the next layer of control was already in place. It didn't rely on chaos. It relied on erasing my boundaries entirely. The boundary violations didn't begin with anything dramatic. They began with access. She wanted to know where I was at all times, not in an overt way. She framed it as care, concern, connection. If I didn't respond quickly, she worried. If I needed time alone, she felt excluded. If I kept something private, she felt deceived. Each request sounded reasonable. Each reaction seemed emotional, not controlling. So I yielded. She showed up unannounced. She went through my phone under the pretense of transparency. She shared personal details of our relationship with others without asking. When I hesitated, she told me intimacy meant openness, that love meant no walls. Boundaries were reframed as betrayal. I didn't lose them all at once. I surrendered them one by one. Every time I tried to reclaim space, she reacted with hurt rather than anger. That hurt made me feel cruel. I didn't want to be the source of her pain. So I compromised again. Over time, my life became fully accessible to her. My time, my thoughts, my emotional bandwidth. I had nothing that was just mine. That erosion set the stage for something worse. Gaslighting. It started gently. She corrected my memory, adjusted details, reframed conversations. When I questioned it, she insisted she was just clarifying. At first, I trusted her. When I remembered a comment she made that hurt me, She said she never said it that way. When I recalled a decision we made together, she said I had misunderstood. When I noticed patterns in her behavior, she said I was reading too much into things. She spoke calmly, patiently, as if guiding me back to reality. So I doubted myself. The gaslighting didn't rely on blatant denial. It relied on accumulation, small inconsistencies, slight shifts, enough to destabilize confidence without triggering alarm. She remembered my mistakes in perfect detail. Dates, words, tones. She recalled them vividly and often. Her own harmful actions, however, seemed to vanish from memory. She genuinely appeared confused when I mentioned them. That asymmetry mattered. I began keeping mental notes, then actual notes. I needed reference points. I needed proof. I didn't realize how far I had fallen until I noticed I no longer trusted my own mind. Reality became something we negotiated rather than shared. If my version of events conflicted with hers, tension followed. If I accepted her version, calm returned. The pattern trained me quickly. I stopped insisting. I started deferring. That deference spread beyond memory. It affected judgment, interpretation, emotion. If I felt hurt, I questioned whether I was being unreasonable. If I felt angry, I wondered if I was projecting. If I felt confused, I assumed it was my fault. She reinforced that assumption constantly. She positioned herself as the rational one, the patient one, the one trying to help me see clearly. She expressed concern about my perceptions, about my emotional responses, about my ability to interpret situations accurately. Her concern sounded caring. It wasn't. It was corrosive. The more I accepted her framing, the more dependent I became on her version of reality. And the more dependent I became, the less capable I was of challenging her. I noticed my confidence eroding, not dramatically, subtly. I hesitated before speaking. I softened statements into questions. I sought validation before trusting my own conclusions. I was losing authority over my own experience. Boundaries were impossible in this state. How do you defend a line when you're not sure it exists? How do you protect space when you've been convinced that needing space is evidence of wrongdoing? She took advantage of that confusion. Every boundary attempt was reframed. If I asked for privacy, she accused me of secrecy. If I asked for independence, she accused me of distance. If I asked for respect, she accused me of control. The emotional manipulation was precise. It targeted my values. I didn't want to be cold, or selfish, or deceptive. She knew that. So she used those labels strategically. I began policing myself internally before she had to. I preemptively corrected thoughts. I filtered desires. I minimized needs. That internalization was the most dangerous shift. Once the control moved inside me, she didn't need to enforce it externally anymore. I complied automatically. I didn't notice when my world became smaller, when friends faded, when hobbies disappeared, when silence felt unsafe. I only noticed that life felt heavier, less defined, less mine. The gaslighting reached its peak when she framed her distortions as care. She told me she worried about my mental health, that my perceptions seemed unreliable, that she was trying to help me stay grounded. Hearing that from someone you trust destabilizes you more than hearing it from an enemy. I questioned myself constantly, and in questioning myself, I surrendered the last stable ground I had left. By the time I understood what was happening, I was deeply disoriented. I didn't know which memories were accurate, which reactions were justified, which instincts were valid. I only knew one thing: challenging her reality always made things worse. So I stopped. I accepted confusion as normal. doubt as humility, self-erasure as love. I didn't know yet that this was preparation for the next stage, where control would no longer be subtle, where fear would replace confusion, where my emotional investment would be used directly against me. But the foundation was complete. My boundaries were gone. My confidence was fractured. My reality was no longer my own. Once my boundaries were gone and my confidence weakened, fear became the primary tool. It didn't arrive as terror. It arrived as consequence. She learned exactly which threats she didn't need to speak out loud. A shift in tone, a withdrawal of affection, a sudden emotional collapse. Each response communicated the same message. If I didn't comply, something bad would happen. The relationship itself became the hostage. When I disagreed, she spiraled. When I asserted independence, she destabilized. When I tried to reclaim space, she hinted at leaving, breaking down, or being unable to cope. She didn't have to say it explicitly. My emotional investment filled in the blanks. I became responsible for her stability. Any action that upset her was reframed as harm. My choices weren't just preferences. They were risks, threats, potential disasters. The fear of triggering her reaction shaped my behavior more effectively than any rule ever could. That was emotional terrorism. She also threatened indirectly through reputation. She spoke about how people saw her, how misunderstood she had been in the past, how easily narratives could be twisted. I understood the implication. Challenging her publicly would not go well for me. So I stayed silent. I managed her emotions instead of expressing my own. I monitored her mood constantly. I preemptively adjusted to avoid fallout. I lived in a state of emotional compliance. There was no safety in honesty. The identity erosion accelerated. She didn't tell me to stop seeing certain people. She expressed discomfort, hurt, anxiety. She framed her reactions as emotional truth. And because I was responsible for her emotional state, I adjusted. One by one, friendships faded. Activities disappeared. Parts of myself that didn't align with her needs were quietly abandoned. She rewarded compliance. When I mirrored her preferences, she softened. When I adopted her opinions, she relaxed. When I became smaller, she felt secure. That reinforcement reshaped me. I didn't wake up one day a different person. I became one gradually. My interests narrowed. My voice softened. My convictions weakened. I stopped doing things that energized me because they disrupted the system. She framed these changes as growth, as maturity, as becoming more aligned. I believed her because the alternative was facing how much I had lost. The theft of identity was complete when I stopped recognizing my own reactions. I no longer trusted excitement or anger or desire. Everything was filtered through the question of how it would affect her. My inner world revolved around anticipation and correction. I existed in relation to her, not as myself. When I tried to heal, she intervened. Therapy made her uncomfortable. She questioned its value. She worried it would change me. Personal development was framed as avoidance. Growth was framed as distance. Whenever I took steps toward stability, a crisis appeared. Sudden emotional breakdowns, emergencies, needs that couldn't wait. My healing time was consumed by her distress. Every attempt to get better was interrupted. She knew exactly which buttons to push. She triggered old guilt, old responsibility, old fear. She pulled me back into the dynamics she could control. The sabotage was subtle. She didn't forbid healing. She undermined it. She used my own language against me, accused me of manipulation when I communicated clearly, accused me of selfishness when I set boundaries. She framed my health as a threat. I felt torn between survival and loyalty. The most disorienting part was how she claimed to support my growth while preventing it in practice. She said she wanted me healthy, then reacted negatively whenever I acted healthier. The contradiction kept me confused. By this point, I was deeply fragmented. Afraid to leave, afraid to stay, afraid to speak, afraid to remain silent. Every option carried risk. I didn't realize how controlled I was until I imagined a life without her and felt panic instead of relief. That panic wasn't love. It was trauma bonding. The relationship had trained my nervous system to associate intensity with connection, stress with meaning, relief with affection. I was addicted to the cycle. She created crises, then resolved them. Each resolution felt like love. Each calm felt earned. I worked harder and harder for smaller and smaller rewards. The unpredictability kept me hooked. Positive moments became intermittent, rare, unpredictable, and that made them more valuable. I chased them. I waited for them. I sacrificed for them. The lows grew deeper. The highs grew shorter. But the bond strengthened. I told myself the intensity meant depth, that the difficulty proved importance, that leaving would destroy something rare. I was wrong. Intensity is not intimacy. Fear is not attachment. Pain is not proof of value. The bond was not built on connection. It was built on survival. By the time I recognized that my sense of self was barely intact, my confidence was shattered, my life was constricted, my nervous system was exhausted. And yet part of me still believed I was responsible for her well-being. That belief was the final chain. Breaking it required seeing the truth clearly, not just about her, but about myself. And that clarity was the most dangerous thing of all. Before you leave, there is one lesson worth holding on to, not just for relationships, but for life itself. Real danger rarely arrives loudly. It doesn't announce itself with cruelty or chaos at the beginning. It arrives quietly wrapped in need, vulnerability, and familiarity. It asks for your empathy before it asks for your boundaries. And if you are not paying attention, you will mistake emotional intensity for depth obligation for love, and self-erasure for loyalty. A healthy connection does not require you to abandon your inner compass. It does not ask you to doubt your memory, minimize your instincts, or shrink your identity to keep someone stable. Love that costs you your sense of self is not love. It is a transaction where you are slowly paying with your peace. You are not responsible for regulating another adult's emotions. You are not cruel for having limits. And you are not broken for feeling drained in a relationship that demands more than it gives. Growth feels steady. Safety feels quiet. And real intimacy expands you instead of consuming you. If something in this story felt uncomfortably familiar, don't rush to judge yourself. Awareness is not weakness. It is the beginning of freedom. The moment you stop asking, how do I keep this person from falling apart, and start asking, who am I becoming here, your life begins to realign. If this resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what stood out or where you're watching from. And if you value conversations that cut through confusion and return you to yourself, consider subscribing to the channel, not for motivation, not for drama, but for clarity.